Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grows Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to ask the question of what if Reconstruction had succeeded? So with regard to this, as always, we're going to give a bit of the context. But before we do that, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, share if you haven't already, sharing is caring, and subscribe if you're one of those 5,000 people roughly who watch our video every single month and yet haven't subscribed. I don't know what you're doing, but join the club. The water's lovely out here, and so that's what we're gonna do. So now's your opportunity to subscribe. So first of all, what is Reconstruction? So Reconstruction is what happened in the period in America after slavery. So we're gonna give a bit of context with regard to slavery first. So many people have the idea that slavery in America was predominantly within what's today the United States. However, the vast majority of the slaves who were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas actually went to Brazil and to the Caribbean. So only a tiny trickle, relatively speaking, went to the United States. However, in the United States, you end up having many people, obviously, who came from England. Like this is, like most of the rest of the colonists, came from England. And so they were imbued with this kind of idea of, life, liberty, and property. Now, there's an inherent contradiction with this, which is a kind of inherent contradiction of liberalism historically, which is that, how can you have life, liberty, and property if some people are property, right? And if some people don't have liberty, and if their life can be taken away from them like that, right? So this is kind of one of the things where it's like in other societies that had slavery, they didn't have these kind of high ideals, didn't have these kind of like liberal values, right? And therefore, slaves were just slaves because they were slaves, right? But within the United States in particular, you end up having this problem whereby slaves, to justify slavery, if all men are created equal, then some men are less equal than others, right? So that's kind of how slavery was kind of justified. And so the kind of racism which kind of became central to this idea of maintaining slavery had long-lasting effects. So so the issue of slavery in the United States became far more of a racialized one. And so even after slavery was abolished, we see even to this day, there still is a large impact from that kind of racist rhetoric that kind of went with it, right? Now, the founding fathers, right, they understood this contradiction better than most, predominantly because while they were talking about all these high ideals, and fighting for freedom, etc., many of them were prolific slave owners, right? And even if they didn't own slaves themselves, their family and their family businesses were heavily tied up within the slave trade, right? And within the institution of slavery. So no one said it better than Thomas Jefferson himself, the very author of the Declaration of Independence, when he said with regard to slavery that we have the wolf by the ear and we can neither hold on to it nor safely let it go. Justice is in one hand and self-preservation is in the other. Now, this self-preservation that he was talking about was with regard to, if you look at places like Haiti, if you look at places like many places in like the Caribbean, if you look even within the United States itself, whenever there were slave uprisings, whenever there were slave rebellions, what tended to happen is that the whites, both the slave owners and just the white people in general in these localities, would be massacred, right? So the big fear of many of the founding fathers was that, okay, we've got all these slaves living here, but if we free them, are they not going to want to put, exact revenge on us, right? They're not going to basically be the so-called servile insurrection, right? So this was the big fear of the founding fathers. So when they talk about, we can't hold on to it, they don't want to maintain slavery, but at the same time, if they just let all the slaves go, where do the slaves go? Right? So this is kind of a big problem that many of them had. And also, we obviously have to kind of make the very clear point that, many people, especially these founding fathers, believed that African Americans, right, or black people in general, were incapable of civilization, were incapable of, basically being functioning members of a civilized society. And therefore, they kind of was like, well, how can these people ever become citizens, right? How can these people, surely they're always going to just be a problem. And so, for many of them, there was a kind of debate about, sending them back to Africa, but then obviously that would be incredibly costly, both to round them up and to transport them and stuff. And obviously as well, they kind of, many of the people viewed them as being their property, so then they'd have to be compensated for it. So for many different reasons, it kind of stalled, right? And the founding fathers, they did try and have some get out clauses. So, for instance, within the Constitution, it laid out that that the slave trade would be ended by 1808. So there'd be no more slaves being imported. And the founding fathers also believed that at the time, slavery was on its way out. That's the belief that they had. And it looked as if this was the case until the invention of something called the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, right? Now, the cotton gin, it basically was a mechanized machine which helped the extraction of like cotton, and therefore, cotton became much cheaper and it became much easier to mass produce, and therefore you end up having the rise of so-called king cotton, right? So by the time of 1860, about half of America's exports came from cotton, right? So this led to an explosion of slavery, right? So just at the time when the founding fathers thought that slavery would die out as an institution, the problem actually got far worse, right? And actually slavery spread across the newly created southern states, such as Mississippi, Alabama, etc., etc. So there was a big problem with regard to all this, which was that, you had more and more of this problem becoming more and more ramped up, and the slave owners having more and more power. So this ended up leading essentially to the American Civil War, because the Confederacy broke away from the Union. Now, many people would try to say that the Civil War was started for different reasons. They said, oh, it's to do with states' rights, or it's to do with tariffs. As we discussed in other videos, this is a nonsense, because it's the states' rights to own slaves. And it was with regard to tariffs, the northern states which wanted to industrialize, and so for them, they were in favor of tariffs because it kept foreign competition away. Whereas the southern states, which were heavily export and import dependent, they wanted to basically export like raw materials and then import manufactured materials from the rest of the world. So they were highly opposed to the tariffs, right? So to say that, oh, it was to do with every other reason except for slavery is just a nonsense. Never mind the fact that the stated reason for many of the people within the Confederacy was that they wanted to uphold the institution of slavery, and that they believed in the preservation of the so-called like undeniable truth here that the black man is inferior to the white man, or so they said, right? So the Civil War happened, and moderates within the Republican Party, in particular President Abraham Lincoln, they basically wanted, at the beginning of the war, to just do the bare minimum to bring the South back, right? They just wanted to end the rebellion and to bring the states back in. So there was none of this kind of talk about ending slavery at that in those early days. So it wasn't until 1862/63 when you had the Emancipation Proclamation. So what this said was that all slaves within the rebellious states would be freed upon like the arrival of Union troops. So whenever the Union troops would liberate a place, if there were slaves there, they would be freed. Now, this didn't apply to the border states, which had stayed loyal, right? So places like Maryland, places like Kentucky, places like Missouri. So these states here, which didn't break away from the Union, slavery was still maintained as an institution there. So it wasn't actually the full kind of emancipation. It wasn't like the full end of slavery as such, right? And also, we have to bear in mind that Abe Lincoln, just like many other people, both North and South, were still white supremacists, right? So we spoke earlier about Haiti. Now, Haiti wasn't recognized by the United States until 1862. Now, why was it not recognized until 1862? The reason for this is because had they recognized it before 1862, then this would have given credence to the one successful slave rebellion in history, right? So Haiti, formerly San Domingo, which had been a French colony, right? The slaves there rose up, killed the white people who were there, and instituted their own independent republic. So if the United States had recognized Haiti before this time, it would have given credence to this idea. And so the fear was that the slaves within the South would then use that, and then they'd rise up and do a similar thing. But by 1862, the thinking was that if they recognize Haiti, what they can do is basically round up all the slaves and then dump them in Haiti, right? So, the 4 million slaves who were in these southern states, basically just get rid of them, right? And then in the future, there won't be any kind of problem. So this was kind of what was thought of by Lincoln and many other people. Now, for various different reasons, this didn't end up happening, right? But what did end up happening was that the South was put under military occupation. So as you can see on the map here, these are the different states, and these are the different military occupation zones, right? And so during this time, there was a great kind of debate about what ought to be done with these southern states, right? And there's three specific stances, right? One is the reconciliationist route, right? Which is basically saying, okay, what we should do is very likely punish the South, but realistically what we should do is just allow the states to kind of like rejoin as soon as possible and put this whole civil war mess behind us, right? Then there's the white supremacist stance, which is basically, at worst, like either maintaining slavery or, like scaling it back. So like, okay, so instead of like there being slavery, instead like kind of black people are just basically second class citizens. But like the kind of basic power structures where like white people are in control, that's basically maintained. And then the third one, which was the emancipationist one, right? This was predominantly people in the North. These are so-called radical Republicans, because obviously the Republican Party was the party that was opposed to slavery. And that's why the South like kind of rose up when Lincoln, the first Republican president, was elected. So for them, they wanted to basically punish the South. And in particular, they wanted to punish the slave owners, right? By confiscating their land and distributing it amongst the newly freed slaves. So this was kind of an idea which the first inklings of it was kind of suggested by General Sherman, where he gave his famous Field Order number 15, I believe, right? And this basically said that the slaves within this liberated territory which he had, right, would be given 40 acres and a mule. So the idea behind this is basically, right, confiscating the land from the former slavers and then giving it to the slaves, as a means of like rebalancing the kind of like all the kind of discrimination and like all the wrong that was done to the slaves, but also giving them the means to basically take care of themselves, to be kind of independent, fully functioning members of like the society, right? So the idea that these people would now become citizens with full voting rights, full economic rights, and would be independent citizens just like everyone else. So this was on the more radical end of it, right? So in the early days, because many of the southern states were not admitted to the Union, what this meant was that the northern states, which was predominantly Republican, they were able to push through quite radical things, and this was known as Reconstruction. So there were 3 amendments, which are called the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, and this is the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. So the 13th Amendment abolished involuntary servitude, So basically this ended slavery. However, within that it said, unless it's as a means of punishment. So that's why you still have the prison industrial complex today. So basically prisoners can still be forced to do involuntary servitude, right? So whether they want to or not, they still can be forced to do that. And actually, in some ways, slavery still continues to today as a result of this tiny little get out clause, right? So this was passed between 1865 and 1866, and the last state which ratified this was the state of Mississippi in, get this, 2013. Right, so obviously it was abolished in like the whole of the United States, including Mississippi, a long time before that. But the idea is still like, it took Mississippi that long to kind of get around to actually like ratifying this amendment, right? So that was the 13th Amendment. Then you had the 14th Amendment, right? And this gives equal citizenship to all peoples born within the United States. So regardless of where your family were from, regardless of whether they're in form of servitude, if you are born in the United States, you are a US citizen. So even Boris Johnson, who was born in the United States, although he's the UK Prime Minister, if he wanted to, he could apply to be a US citizen, right? And it would be guaranteed that by this birthright citizenship. And then also within the 14th Amendment, it offers equal protection under the law, regardless of race, color, or form of servitude, right? So basically this says that, so regardless of whether you're white or black, etc., everyone is going to be treated equally under the law, and no one can be discriminated because of race or form of servitude, right? So this was passed in 1868. And then finally, you have in the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, and this is what gave black people equal voting rights, or rather, I should say, black males equal voting rights, because obviously this is the day before women's suffrage, right? So this guaranteed that regardless of race, colour, or form of servitude, there was no rules that could be imposed by any states or like by the federal government, saying that people did not have the right to vote. But there's little get out clauses within that, because what they basically then did in these southern governments is they found other reasons to basically disenfranchise black people, but we'll get onto that a little bit later, right? So as we discussed in some of our other videos, so definitely check those out. Abraham Lincoln was obviously assassinated shortly after the Civil War in 1865. So then what you end up having afterwards was Andrew Johnson, right? Now, Andrew Johnson had been a Southern Democrat. However, he ended up fleeing to the North because he was in favor of maintaining the Union, right? So he was still very much in favor of white supremacy, of maintaining slavery, of all that stuff, right? So everything that the Confederacy stood for, minus, splitting away from the United States. So this is basically what his kind of stance was, right? So as a result of this, he ended up pushing through a lot of vetoes, yeah? So anytime the radical Republicans push through a law like the Civil Rights Act or any of these amendments, he would always try and veto it. However, because of the makeup of the Congress in those days, because as we said, those southern states have not been readmitted back into the Union yet, right? That's how they were able to override his veto. So he was very much a kind of like lame duck president, and they actually tried to impeach him as well, although this was unsuccessful. But kind of gives you an idea of, even at a federal level, there was mass resistance to this, right? But down in the south, yeah, right, where they're under military occupation, what you're having was basically white supremacist terrorism. So the Ku Klux Klan, which we all kind of famously know about, right, that was founded in 1866. And although it was eventually crushed in 1871, although obviously it would like re-emerge in different forms over the years, right? So the first Klan, as it was called, was crushed by 1871. But there were other organizations such as the White League and other kind of terrorist organizations and just kind of mass mobilization, right, against African Americans, right? So there was terrorism both for, on economic terms, on political terms, and just in civil society terms, right? So the number of lynchings that took place during this time, the amount of like voter suppression, intimidation, everything, right? Houses were burnt down, schools were burnt down, businesses were burnt down. This was a really terrible time for many African Americans who had only just been freed, right? So the federal government, with its federal troops, yeah, like kind of were stationed in the south, and these were the only kind of people who were protecting the rights of African Americans there, right? But still, these African Americans weren't given the just compensation, yeah, that they would have needed. And so over time, what you end up having was akin to basically post-war fatigue. So what we have to kind of understand is, obviously by the time it gets to the election of 1876, which we're going to get onto a little bit, right, you're talking about something which happened 11 years after the Civil War. So for many different reasons, people in the North kind of got tired of having to fully occupy the South. In many ways today, it's very similar to, opposition to American involvement in Afghanistan, where you think about it, it's like, okay, right, maintaining troops there, etc., etc., it's very costly, etc., etc. It's been going on for a long time. We should kind of just wrap this thing up. However, the problem, as in that case and in this case, is that as soon as you withdraw those US troops, is that, the local people there like basically end up taken over again, and they end up imposing their tyranny onto the rest of the population, right? So this is very similar to kind of what ended up happening like in post Reconstruction South. So for various different reasons, yeah, after 1873, you end up having more and more control of the South being put back in the hands of the Democratic Party. And don't forget that at this time, the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy. It was the party of white Southern voters, right? And the Republican Party at that time was the party of the newly freed African Americans, right? So today in the South, like it's kind of completely flipped, whereby, especially in some states, overwhelming majority of whites vote for Republicans and the overwhelming majority of blacks vote for the Democrats. But in this time, it was completely flipped. So you end up having the so-called Redeemers, right? So these are white conservative Democrats in the South, and they end up taking more and more control over the next few years, right? Now, this is for many different reasons, yeah. So first of all, obviously, you had a lot of corruption within the Grant administration. So many people kind of swayed away from voting for the Republicans because of that. On top of that, you had the Panic of 1873, which is basically a recession. So people in both the North and South had other kind of concerns. They were like, okay, this occupation is kind of costing quite a lot. Let's kind of scale back on this. But on top of that, you end up having more and more terrorism and intimidation, yeah, which put black people in their so-called place, right? So this is largely how many of these white Southerners in the South were able to kind of like take more and more control away from black people, right? So by the time of the presidential election in 1876, it's not looking good for Republicans, right? So the Democrats under Tilden ends up winning the popular vote by 50.9% of the vote. compared to Rutherford B. Hayes, who gets just 47.9% of the popular vote. However, when it comes to the electoral college, which remember is actually how the president is elected in America, in this election, the Democratic Party had 184 electoral college votes and needed 185 in order to win. But there were three states that were up for debate, right? So one of them was Florida, the other was Louisiana, and the third was South Carolina, right? So these states were up in question, and basically many of the Democrats kind of threatened that there'd be a second civil war if they weren't handed the election. So what they end up being is basically a backroom deal, which is the so-called Compromise of 1867, which African Americans to this day still call the Great Betrayal. So the reason for this is because they said, okay, right, you as the Republicans can win this election, right? We'll give you these three states. However, the military occupation of the South has to end. So Rutherford B. Hayes ends up becoming the next president. However, for all intents and purposes, as people have said, you know, the North won the Civil War and the South won Reconstruction, right? So this ended up marking the end of Reconstruction. So the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. So the voter suppression and intimidation of African Americans in the South, which had already started, now just went into overdrive, right? And this is why eventually you end up having the Jim Crow laws, which were put in over the next few decades. And so within this, we're going to ask the question of what would have happened if basically the Compromise of 1867, this great betrayal, hadn't been allowed to happen, right? And the Republican Party in the North has stood on principles. And yeah, so that's what we're going to look into now. So first of all, we have to kind of look at the situation post-Civil War. So black people for the first time were able to vote, and they were able to stand for Congress, right? And they were able to stand for senators, for governorships, and for like the state legislature within their own states. So looking at some of the data here, yeah, we can see in 1867, this is some of the representation within those states. So in the state of Louisiana, right, 50% of the population there were white, and yet just 36% of the delegates, yeah, within that state were white, right? Now we're going to look at South Carolina, so 41% white population, 39% of the delegates there are white, right? So you can really see in these two states, if anything, it's either level or it's kind of, if anything, like whites are being underrepresented, right? Now we're going to start to look at Florida, right, which was the third of these three states we mentioned earlier. So 51% of the population there is white, and 61% of the representatives there are white. But now it starts to get very much, this is where we start to realize that there's a little bit more going on, right? Which is this. So the state of Virginia, 58% of the population there is white. However, 76% of the delegates are white. In Mississippi, you know, so just 46% of the population there are white, and yet 80% of the delegates there are white, right? So that's a little bit suspicious, very, very suspicious, right? So even in these early days, all the way back in 1867, which is just 2 years after the Civil War, we're already starting to see there's some suspicious behavior. Now look at Georgia, where it's 54% white, 80% of the delegates are white. Then we look at Alabama, 52% white, 85% of the delegates are white. In North Carolina, it's 63% white and 89% of the delegates are white. And then in Texas, where 69% of the population are white, 90% of the delegates there are white. So you can really kind of see from this, yeah, even in these early days of Reconstruction, that in some of the states, you know, black people were getting a fair share in terms of like the representation. However, in some of these other states, you know, obviously there's going to be some disparities. Even in present day, there's some disparities between the state's population and the number of representatives there. But something to kind of bear in mind is when the gap is this big, like in states like Mississippi, where it's, you know, 46% to 80%, somewhere there you can see there's a bit of discrepancy. So now let's look at the census of 1870, just to give us a bit of a kind of like background to this, right? Because this is the kind of, this is the census before the election of 1876. This is how the districts were drawn up. So in South Carolina, 59% of the population there are African American, but just 50% of the population there voted for the Republicans. Now, bearing in mind, as we've said, you know, in the South, you know, the Democrats are the party of white supremacy, and the Republican Party are mainly voted for by black people, right? So it seems quite strange already in this state of South Carolina that in a state where it's 59% of the population are black, that 50% of the state's population would vote for that, right? So why would black people be voting for a white supremacist party? Seems a bit strange, right? Then when we compare the state of Louisiana, which had 50% of the population being black, you can see that 52% of the population voted for the Republican Party. So bear in mind that, like, you know, these are one of the places where the military occupation is still kind of, largely kind of like being held up. And you can see, as in the first case, yeah, you can see that black people seem to be getting a decent level of representation, especially in the state of Louisiana. Then when we compare it to Florida, where there's 49% of the population there are African American, we can see that 51% of the population there vote for the Republicans, right? So in these three states, these are the three states being contested, and yet why are they being contested? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be any kind of shenanigans going on, you know. But what we're going to get into now is some of the other states, right? And bear in mind that many of these states are the same ones which we highlighted in 1867. So let's just look out for them, right? So Mississippi, again, right? 54% of the population there is African American, and yet just 32% of them in this election vote for the Republicans. Now, bear in mind that in the previous election in 1872, 63% of that state population voted for Republicans, right? So it's a bit of a shift, right? Now, I know obviously many of the whites in many like the states and stuff weren't allowed to vote because, you know, if they'd served like in the Confederacy, like there was different rules, etc., for a short time like after the Civil War. But it seems quite strange that from 1872 to 1876, there's that much of a turnover. So it goes from being, you know, 63% Republican to being just 32%, right, in the space of one election. So it seems like there's a bit of shenanigans kind of going on, right? Then when we look at Alabama, we can see a similar thing, and also within the state of Georgia, we also see a similar thing, right? So many of these states are very, very suspicious, right? And if we look at these states here, where you have either a majority of the population being African American, or at very least a large plurality, when these states somehow end up going to the Democratic Party, it's very, very suspicious, right? So Georgia, for instance, being 46% black, and yet just 28% of the population vote for the Republican Party, seems a little bit suspicious. And Alabama as well, where it's like almost 48% of the population being black and just 40% vote for the Republican Party, seems a little bit suspicious in these states, right? So you can already see that even by the election of 1876, there's already foul play, right? So what the investigation really should have been is not focusing on those three states here of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, where it seems to be okay, right? In actual fact, what it should have been is these three other states, right? Which is, you know, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. These are the three states which there seem to be quite a lot of suspicion over. And actually, if we combined these 6 states which we're kind of looking at, right, where there seems to be some level of foul play and stuff, right, if all of those went to the Republican Party, well, then this election wouldn't have been very close in terms of electoral college votes. As a matter of fact, it instead would be 214 electoral college votes to the Republican Party to just 155 for the Democrats. So yes, okay, the Democrats won like the popular vote, but actually, if we look at like one election to the next, again, I'm very dubious of that. I'm very suspicious of that because clearly there seems to have been some level of voter suppression in some of these states for like black voters. So more likely than not, that popular vote isn't actually representative of what was actually on the ground and stuff, right? So that's something to really bear in mind. So in order for this timeline to succeed, what it would have basically meant is basically the Republican Party standing up for its own self-interest, instead of in this case where, you know, strangely, like, you know, the Northern Republicans chose race instead of party loyalty, right? So if they were thinking strategically, they'd be like, okay, cool, like you know, black people in the South, in many of these states make a majority, you know, like if we defend their voting rights, they're going to continually vote for us. So therefore, like the South is not going to just be a desert when it comes to the Republican Party, as would happen in later decades. However, the big caveat is this would never happen because bear in mind, people in the North in this time are still really, really racist as well. So it's a bit complicated, right? Because what we have to understand is that when we kind of look at history in a kind of very simplistic way, where we kind of go, South is racist, North is not racist, right? Actually, there's a lot of racist in the North, and actually, as we'll get onto a little bit later, there's some anti-racists in the South, right? And this is something to really bear in mind. So before talking about, what if Reconstruction has succeeded, let's actually look at some of the successes of Reconstruction, right? So first of all, in 1865, you had a situation where you had illiterate, landless, formerly freed slaves, right? So, they couldn't read or write, they had no money, they had no savings, they had nothing to their name, right? And it was actually illegal in many of these states for people to read or write, right? For slaves to read or write. So as a result of this, literacy in 1865 amongst slaves was just 5%. However, thanks to something called the Freedom Bureau, you end up having, so the Freedom Bureau was split into two different parts, right? So one part was to do with education, and the other part was to do with like banking and finance and stuff, right? So the first part, when we were talking about it with regard to education, is that you had many teachers who went and purposely went to increase literacy amongst the newly freed slaves. Now, there's a big misconception, a lot of like kind of the publicity about this in terms of like, basically, well, the propaganda of this essentially was that it was a lot of like northern white women who traveled down to the South. Now, when you actually look into the data of this, what we found is that actually predominantly it was male teachers as opposed to female teachers within the Bureau. And actually, when we look at the number of people who came from what place or etc., we find that actually just 1/6 of the teachers within the Freedmen Bureau were actually Northerners, right? So 1/3 of the teachers within the Freedmen Bureau were black, and obviously most of them came from the South. But actually, half of the teachers, or roughly half of all the teachers placed within this Freedmen Bureau were Southern whites, right? And these were so-called scallywags. So these were people who were really demonized by a lot of whites in the South. But actually, these people were anti-racist, and they were opposed to slavery even during the Civil War. They were opposed to secession, and they basically wanted to elevate the rights of freed black men, right, to the same level as them. So they wanted racial equality, even at a time when the vast majority of people were wholly opposed to this, right? So that's something which kind of goes against some of the narrative which we have, which is of like all the whites in the South were racist. Actually, we look into some of the history of it. As with all things, the myth kind of unpacks itself a bit. Not to say that the vast majority of whites in the South were hella racist, but just bear in mind that actually there were quite a lot of good ones as well. And then the second part of the Friedman thing, which we mentioned, is the kind of the thing to do with like finances and stuff, right? So this is like setting up banks, this is setting up loans for the different people and stuff, right? So as a result of this, by the time it gets to 1900, 1/4 of all the African Americans in America, they own their own land. Now, bear in mind when we compare this to white Southerners, right? When we compare this to white Southern farmers, 63% of them own their own land, right? So it's a bit of a gap. 25% of black farmers own their own land compared to 63% for white farmers, right? And this is mainly because what many of the people in the South wanted, especially obviously like the kind of white supremacists, they wanted to basically maintain slavery in all but name. So that's why they implemented the systems called sharecropping, right? So you don't own your own land, you don't own your own materials and stuff, right? What happens is basically, in many cases, your former slave owner, allows you to have like room and board, right? And like a tiny little hut. So you stay there, you work the field, you get some money, but not really much money at all. You get to keep some of like the crop that you have, and you can sell it and stuff. But it's kind of, there's no guarantee. So it's basically like slavery minus the whips, right? And with tiny bit of pay, but that's kind of it. So this is unfortunately the position that most of black people, like kind of in the kind of Reconstruction era, and like even quite late into the 20th century, had to face, right, which is this sharecropping like model, right? So as a result, for many black people, they're unable to kind of like rise above their station. They're unable to kind of lift themselves out of poverty, right? Although it is something to note that with regard to the handful of blacks who actually own their own land, right, by the coast, on average, they tended to own about 27 acres, right, per black farmer. But further inland, they averaged about 48 acres per farmer, right? So this kind of gets a little bit closer to this kind of 40 acres a mule thing. However, bear in mind, obviously, that this doesn't apply to the vast majority of black people who, as we said, 3/4 of them didn't own their own land. So there was some progress with Reconstruction, but it was no way as radical as it probably ought to have been, right? So what other effects can we think of would have happened if Reconstruction had succeeded? Well, what ended up happening as a result of these Jim Crow laws being introduced and stuff, right, was that many black people in the South was like, right, we want to get out of here. And they end up basically migrating to the north, and this became known as the Great Migration. So when we look at cities in the north, such as LA, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, etc., the reason why they have such a large black population even today is as a result of this Great Migration of people moving out the south. And it also helped as well that within the north, on average, black people, although they'd be paid less than whites, they'd be paid almost 2 or 3 times more than they would in the south, right? So many of them end up seeing that economic kind of pull and decided to move and stuff, right? So this is really something to kind of like bear in mind, yeah, that if things have been better in the South today would probably have maintained this large black population, and northern states would have much less of a black population as well. So in conclusion to this video, obviously black people in general in America would have had much better economic opportunities, especially if they'd been given this kind of 40 acres and a mule thing. But even if they hadn't been given as kind of as radical slash deserved kind of compensation for this, right? Just having federal troops maintaining their civil rights and and their economic rights and their social rights, right? I think many black people in America today would have had a much better kind of starting point than was otherwise the case, right? You know, so if you look at poverty rates amongst the black community in 1940, it's 87% poverty rate. By the time it gets to 1960, it's dropped down to 47%. And then by the time it gets to 1970, it's dropped down to 30%, right? So you really see that like when black people are finally given opportunities to kind of like do well for themselves, they're able to get out of poverty, they're able to educate themselves, they're able to succeed and stuff. But at the same time, something to bear in mind is if the Ku Klux Klan and these other terrorist organizations, yeah, terrorized blacks even when they had nothing, what's to say that, you know, if this land had been redistributed and if this occupation had continued, etc., what's to say that white hostility, yeah, this kind of white backlash wouldn't have been even greater in the South, yeah? So that's something to also bear in mind as well, yeah. Like as with all things, yeah, there's no solutions, only trade-offs, yeah. I think on the whole, it would have been better, but we can't assume that if the better policies have been put in place, that the effects of those policies would have actually turned out the way that we would have liked, right? So that's something to really bear in mind. But if you like that video, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, subscribe, share if you haven't already. Sharing is caring. And also as well, check out Instagram. We've got merch and all that stuff. But the next video is going to be on what if the US Constitution was never ratified, right? So after looking at the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, right, you can see like the debate between the two sides after the US War for Independence. So basically what would have happened if the Articles of Confederation had continued and there had been no US Constitution, right? So that's what we're going to get into in the next video. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.